All right, last lesson for chapter 16, all about evolution and Darwin. All right, so our goal is to explain how the scientific theory of evolution is supported by fossil record, compared anatomy, comparative embryology, biogeography, molecular biology, and observe evolutionary change. And we have 5 objectives, so take a look first at our far side. So what's this? I asked for a hammer. A hammer. This is a crescent wrench. Well, maybe it's a hammer. Damn these stone tools. Cute. 5 objectives. All right. First, explain how geologic distribution of species relates to the evolutionary history. Explain how fossils and fossil record document the descent of modern species from ancient ancestors. Describe what homologous structures and embryology suggest about the process of evolutionary change. Explain how molecular evidence can be used to trace the process of evolution. And finally, explain the results of the Grant's investigation of adaptation in Galapagos finches. All right, you ready? You think it's going to be a long one? All right, so let's think about it again. Scientists in some fields, including geology, physics, paleontology, chemistry, and embryology, did not have the technology understanding to test Darwin's assumptions during his lifetime. And other fields like genetics and molecular biology didn't even exist. In 150 years since Darwin published On the Origin of Species, discoveries in these fields have served as independent tests that have supported Darwin's basic ideas about evolution. Objective 1. Explain how geologic distribution of species relates to their evolutionary history. Okie dokie. So biogeography is study of where organisms live and how and where their ancestors live in the past. 2 biogeographical patterns are significant to Darwin's theory. 2. The first is a pattern which closely relates to species differentiate in slightly different climates. The second is a pattern in which very distantly related species develop similarities in similar environments. To Darwin, this biogeography of Galapagos species suggested that population on the islands had evolved from mainland species. And over time, natural selection on the islands produced variations among populations that resulted in different but closely related island species. For example, natural selection produced variations in the shell shaped among the giant land tortoises that exhibit the island. On the other hand, there were similar habitats around the world are often home to animals and plants that are only distantly related. Darwin noted that similar ground-dwelling birds, the rheas, the ostriches, and the emuses, inhabited similar grasslands in Europe, Australia, and Africa. The differences in the body structures among these animals provide evidence that they evolved from different ancestors, but they look very similar. Similarities among those animals, however, provide evidence that similar selection pressures had caused distantly related species to develop similar adaptations. There you go. That's the first objective. Explain how geologic distributions of species relates to the evolutionary history. So what Darwin knows is patterns in distribution of living and fossil species tell us how modern organisms evolved from their ancestors. But there are 2 theories that Darwin had on that, so know them both. We'll discuss them in class too. Objective 2. Explain how fossils and fossil record document the descent of modern species from ancient ancestors. This one's quite obvious, right? Okay. So evolution takes a long time. If life has evolved, then Earth must be really old. Hutton and Lyell argue that Earth was indeed very old, but technology in their day couldn't determine just how old. Geologists now use radioactivity to establish the age of certain rocks and fossils, and radioactive dating indicates that Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. Plenty of time for evolution by natural selection to take place. Darwin's studies of fossils had convinced him and other scientists that life evolved, but paleontologists in 1859 hadn't found enough fossils to intermediate forms of life to document the evolution of modern species from their ancestors. It's like the missing link stuff from all these different animals. So since Darwin, paleontologists have discovered hundreds of fossils that document intermediate stages in the evolution of many different groups of modern species. This one here is the fossil record of a whale. Amazing. It used to be like a land walking like dog thing, as you can see there. Now it's a big swimming thing. One recently discovered fossil series documents the evolution of whale from ancient land mammals, and several reconstructions based on fossil evidence are shown on the following slides. So here we go. The limb structure of the walking whale ambulocetus, forgive me here, suggests that these animals could both swim in shallow water and walk on land. So we had this original animal, which I'm not even going to try to pronounce because I'll make a fool of myself, and then they evolved over time to this land alligator-ish looking thing here. Okay? So the hind limbs, eventually, of the Rhodopsitus walking whale, were short and probably not able to bear much weight, as you can see here. So paleontologists think that these animals might have spent most of their time in water, agua. The Basilosaurus, right here, I think I said that right, had a streamlined body and reduced hind limbs. This tiny little bone pelvis still there. These skeletal figures suggest that the Basilosaurus spent its entire life swimming in the oceans. Okay, think about that. Modern whales now, the Mycetites and the Odontocetes, dolphins, retain reduced pelvic bones and in some cases upper and lower limb bones. However, these structures no longer play a role in locomotion at all. They have a tiny little bone left over there. Other recent fossil finds connect the dots between dinosaurs and birds, and between fish and four-legged land animals. All historical records are incomplete, and the history of life is no exceptions. The evidence we do have, however, tells us an unmistakable story of evolutionary change. So objective 2, explain how fossils and fossil records document the descent of modern species from ancient ancestors. So many recently discovered fossils form series that trace the evolution of modern species from extinct ancestors. Excuse me. Objective 3. Describe what homologous structures and embryology suggest about the process of evolutionary change. This is kind of interesting. This is probably the most interesting one to me. All right, homologous structures. Let's talk about that first. By Darwin's time, scientists had noted that all vertebrate limbs had the same basic bone structures. For example, the front limbs of amphibians, the front limbs of amphibians, right here, amphibians, reptiles, and birds and mammals contain the same basic bones. Darwin proposed that animals with similar structures evolved from a common ancestors with a basic version of that structure. Structures that are shared by related species that have been inherited from a common ancestors are called homologous structures. Like, remember those meiosis homologous tetras? Yeah. Biologists test whether structures are homologous by studying anatomical, details. The way structures develop in embryos and the pattern in which they appear over evolutionary history. Homologous bones are shown by color coding, supporting the differently shaped front limbs of modern vertebrates. These limbs evolved with modification from the front limbs of a common ancestors whose bones resemble those of an ancient fish. Similarities and differences between homologous structures help determine how recently species share common ancestors. For example, the front limbs of reptiles and birds are more similar. Do I not have that there? Yeah, right here. Are more similar, birds, reptiles, all right, to each other than either is to the front limb of an amphibian or mammal. This similarity, among many others, indicates that the common ancestors of reptiles and birds lived more recently than the common ancestors of reptiles, birds, and mammals. Biologists have identified homologies in many other organisms. Certain groups of plants, for example, share homologous stems, roots, and flowers. Clue to common descent is common structure, not common function. A bird's wing, let's go back to that one again. A bird's wing and a horse's front limb have different functions, but similar structures. Body parts that share a common function but not structure are called analogous structures. Like the wing of a bee and the wing of a bird are analogous structures. Common functions, but not common structures. Get the difference? All right, let's move on to vestigial structures then. So not all homologous structures have important functions. Vestigial structures are inherited from ancestors but have lost much or all of their original function due to different selection pressures acting on descendants. The hip bones of the bottlenose dolphins are vestigial structures. In their ancestors, as we saw in the previous slides, hip bones played a role in terrestrial locomotion. However, as the dolphin lineage adapted to life at sea, this function was then lost. Why would an organism possess structures with little or no function? One possibility is that the presence of the vestigial structure does not affect an organism's fitness. In this case, natural selection just wouldn't eliminate it over time because it didn't have an effect on it. We have little tailbones, you know, vestigial structure for us. Think about that. All right. So researchers noticed a long time ago that the early developmental stages of many animals with backbones, what we call vertebrates, looked very similar. Recent observations make clear that the same groups of embryonic cells develop in the same order and in similar patterns to produce many homologous tissues and organisms and vertebrates. Similar patterns of embryological development provide further evidence that organisms have descended from a common ancestors. Evolutionary theories offers the most logical explanation for these similarities and patterns of development. Similar patterns of embryological development provide further evidence that organisms have descended from a common ancestor. So like look at the lizard, the tortoise, the piggy, and the human. Really similar. Again, makes you think. Huh? All right. So objective 3, describe what homologous structures in embryology suggest about the process of evolutionary change. Evolutionary theory explains the existence of homologous structures adapted to different purposes as the result of descent with modification from common ancestors. And so does the embryological theory. All right. Moving on, objective 4, explain how molecular evidence can be used to trace the process of evolution. So Darwin had no idea how heredity worked, and he was worried that his lack of knowledge might prove fatal to his theory. As it happens, some of the strongest evidence supporting evolutionary theory comes from genetics. A long series of discoveries from Mendel to Watson and Crick to genomics helps explain how evolution works. Also, we now understand how mutation and the resulting shuffling of genes during sexual reproduction produce the inheritable variation in which natural selection operates. Meiosis again. All living cells use information coded in DNA and RNA to carry information from one generation to the next and to direct those protein synthesis. This genetic code is nearly identical in almost all organisms. Yes, we share common genetic codes, including the bacteria, yeast, plants, fungi, and us, animals. This chart compares a small portion of DNA for the same gene in 3 animals. You have a mouse, the baleen whale, and chicken. The similarity in genetic code is early people. As you can see, it's still dark behind me. Genetic code is powerful evidence that all organisms evolved from a common ancestors. Similar genetic code. All right. In Darwin's day, biologists could only study similarities and differences in structures they could see. But physical body structures can't be used to compare mice with yeast or bacteria. Today, we know that homology is not limited to physical structures. Homologous proteins share extensive structural and chemical similarities too. One homologous protein is cytochrome C, which functions in cellular respiration. Remarkably, similar versions of cytochrome C are found in almost all living cells, from cells in the yeast to cells in humans. There it is, cytochrome C. Genes can be homologous too. One example is a set of genes that determine the identities of body parts, known as Hox genes. They help to determine the head-to-tail axis in embryonic development. In vertebrates, sets of homologous Hox genes direct the growth of front and hind limbs. Small changes in the genes can produce dramatic changes in the structures they control. Relatively minor changes in an organism's genome can produce major changes in an organism's structure and the structure of its descendants. At least some homologous Hox genes are found in almost all multicellular animals, from fruit flies to humans. For example, bacteria that live in hot spring are very different from animals, yet many of their genes, and therefore the proteins coded by those genes, are similar to those animals. Such profound biochemical similarities are best explained by Darwin's conclusions. living organisms evolved through descent with modification from a common ancestor. You got it now, right? All right. So, objective 4 was to explain how molecular evidence can be used to trace the process of evolution. At the molecular level, the universal genetic code and homologous molecules provide evidence of common descent. Finally, let's talk about the lovely couple called the Grants. Explain the results of the Grants' investigation of adaptation in the Galapagos finches. Alrighty, this is what these people did. They spent their whole life in Galapagos living on this island looking at these birds. So one way to gather evidence for evolutionary change is to actually observe natural selection in action. One of the best examples of natural selection in action comes from the observations of animals living in their natural environment, the Galapagos finches. Darwin hypothesized that the Galapagos finches he observed had descended from a common ancestor. He noted that several finches species had beaks of very different sizes and shapes. Each species uses its beak like a specialized tool to pick up and handle its food. Different types of foods are most easily handled with beaks of different sizes and shapes. Darwin proposed that natural selection had shaped the beaks of different bird populations as they became adapted to eat different foods. That makes sense. No one thought that there was a way to test this hypothesis until Peter and Rosemary Grant of Princeton University came along. The Grants realized that Darwin's hypothesis rested on two testable assumptions. First, for beak size and shape to evolve, there must be enough heritable variation in those traits to provide raw material for natural selection. Second, differences in beak size and shape must produce differences in fitness. So what did these people do? The Grants have tested these hypotheses on medium ground finch on the island of Daphne Major. This island is large enough to support a good-sized finch population, yet small enough to allow the Grants to catch, tag, and identify nearly every bird of the species. During the study, the Grants periodically recaptured the birds. They record which individuals were alive and which had died, and which had reproduced and which have not. For each individual, the Grants record anatomical characteristics like the wing length, the leg length, the beak depth, the beak color, the feather color, and the total mass of the bird. The Grants data has shown that individual finches with different sized beaks have better or worse chances of surviving more seasonal droughts and longer dry spells. And so when food becomes scarce during dry periods, birds with the largest beaks are more likely to survive. And as a result, the average beak size in this finch population has increased dramatically. As you can see from this chart here, changes in food supply created selection pressure, that caused the finch populations to evolve within decades. This evolutionary change occurred much faster than many researchers had thought possible. The Grants have documented that natural selection takes place in the wild finch populations frequently and sometimes very rapidly. The Grants data also confirmed that competition and environmental change drive natural selection. Traits that don't matter much under one set of environmental conditions become adaptive as the environment changes during a drought. Without heritable variation in beak sizes, the medium ground finch, which would not be able to adapt to feed on larger, tougher seeds during a drought. The Grants' work shows that variation within species increases the likelihood of species adapting to and surviving environmental changes. There we go. So like any scientific theory, evolutionary theory is constantly reviewed as new data is gathered. Researchers still debate important questions such as precisely how new species arise and why species become extinct. There is also significant uncertainty about exactly how life began. However, any questions that remain about how evolution works, not whether evolution occurs, there is none. To scientists, evolution is the key to understanding the natural world. So last objective was to explain the results of the Grants' investigation of adaptation of Galapagos finches. The Grants have seen it happen. The natural selection takes place in the wild finch populations frequently and sometimes rapidly. The grant's work shows that variation within a species increases the likelihood of the species at adapting to and surviving environmental change. Those were our 5 objectives. The geologic distribution, all evidence of evolution, geologic distribution, fossil record, homologous structures, embryology, molecular evidence, and actual observation that the grants saw. Then they all support how the scientific theory of evolution is supported by fossil record, comparative anatomy, comparative embryology, biogeography, molecular biology, and observed evolutionary chains. Ta-da! And that's a cute one. Enjoy.